Do you believe that God speaks to you through the Bible? I think that's a good thing. But if so, wouldn't it make sense to read the Bible well? Do you want to see what happens when people don't read the Bible well, but they still think that God is speaking to them? Then watch this video. My name's Torsten Moritz. I'm a New Testament professor and hermeneutics, that's interpretation. I also help many scholars get their PhD so they become professors that are actually helpful to their students. But more important than that, my mission is to help as many people as I can to read the Bible well. If you're interested, then watch this. You've probably heard of the parable of the seed or the sower, or sometimes it's called the parable of the fourfold soil. This is when Jesus addresses the disciples early on in his ministry and his time with them, and he tells them this parable. And when Mark tells us about this in Mark 4, there are at least 5 important components that we need to understand. But when I ask people what they think about those components, nobody ever understands them. I'm not trying to be judgmental, I'm just saying, how are we going to interpret these texts well if we don't understand the essentials? Well, here's what's going to happen if we don't understand these things. We're going to think that the text is about us, and we're going to go into narcissistic mode and think God is speaking to us directly. And then we misuse the text and we miss what it's actually about. 4 of the 5 components we have to understand, and people typically don't, including many preachers, most preachers in fact. Actually, I've never heard a preacher understand those things or explain them well. But 4 of the 5 are found in the first 4 verses. Let's have a look. There's the beside the sea. He's teaching them beside the sea. That's very important. Why is it important? Because of a certain motif that's in play here, and it's an Exodus motif. Remember, the Exodus in Israel's history was delivery through the sea. We have to know that background if we want to interpret this parable well. But most people don't get to that point. They simply think this is about us or this is about personal evangelism. It is not. It's actually more helpful than that. Now, when I've taught this to students in the past, I often got the response that Israel, according to the Old Testament, wasn't just saved through the water, but also in the desert, walking through the desert 40 years and so on. Well, guess what? That number 40 shows up with Jesus again, and the desert shows up with Jesus. Even his precursor, John the Baptist, takes people out into the desert. The point is that that argument actually shows that this is all about Exodus/New Exodus. If we don't see that, we miss out. And here is the problem. When people don't realize that they're misinterpreting text, they also don't realize what they're missing out, which is probably, I would say, at least 2/3 of New Testament theology. Number 2, it says the people were gathered. That word is extremely important in both Testaments, Old and New, and in what Jesus teaches and how he teaches it. He uses this word a lot. Gathering is a word that is often used in both Testaments when the text, or the texts plural, talk about Israel being ready to learn from God. So we already know that Jesus is trying to teach the disciples something against the background of the new Exodus. And that, my friends, is actually one of the most important theological motifs that we find in the entire New Testament. And someone who absolutely gets this is Paul, who's getting a very bad rap lately, especially on social media. He actually understood what Jesus was doing. People sometimes say he never met Jesus, how could he know? Well, somehow people who never met Jesus say 2,000 years later they know better about this than he does. And the people around Paul at the time must have misunderstood him or something. It's just bizarre, but there are a lot of videos floating around on that. It's crazy. Anyway, New Exodus, a very important theological motif. Jesus is the bringer of the new Exodus. That is what's happening here in this parable, and in fact in many parables. If we don't bring that background into the equation, we will not understand what Jesus is doing. Anyway, number 3 is the reference to parables. Why is Jesus speaking in parables at all? Parables are riddles. Well, actually, the prophets used to do that in the past. They even enacted parables. Jesus does that too. It's not always verbal. Sometimes it's an enactment, like what he did with a fig tree, for instance, right over in Mark, 11. And here's the other absolutely crucial theological concept for understanding Jesus and the New Testament. Sometimes it's called remnant theology, that God's people are being challenged to be the real thing, to be really God's people for the benefit of the world. Whether we like it or not, the word for that the Bible uses a lot is remnant. That's something that comes straight from the prophets. In fact, a lot of this terminology here in the parables comes straight from the prophets. Case in point, seed. Why is Jesus talking about seed in the first place? Because in the Old Testament, seed is sometimes used as a metaphor for what God's people are supposed to do in this world. It's about this world in general. It's about being good for humanity. It's not just about Johnny down the road who's sitting in a bar and who needs Jesus. It's not about personal evangelism. The disciples would have had no chance of understanding this parable if that is what Jesus had in mind. Seed, by the way, is also used in Isaiah 6 in the calling episode. And the fifth piece here that is important as background, it's at the end, Jesus concludes the parable telling by saying to people, if you have ears to hear, use them, hear, understand. And that also comes straight out of the calling episode of Isaiah 6. If we want to understand what Jesus is doing, we have to understand Isaiah. That is why in Luke, for instance, chapter 4, he introduces his ministry by quoting from Isaiah, and he does that numerous times. Personal evangelism doesn't fit the bill on any level. In fact, if we go in that direction, we miss what the text is actually about. The text is actually a challenge to God's people to show up and actually be God's people. If your church tells you this is about you or your friend who needs faith, they're actually deflecting attention from the challenge to them as a church, and they're putting it on you. There's something wrong with that. If you want to know how this parable actually functions and who actually needs to hear it, who needs those ears to hear, you can get a free sample of my lecture course on the parables. These are all mini lectures. I'll give you access to one of my lectures on the parables. They are typically about 20 minutes long. And I'll do that in the next video. I'll give you a link. In this one, I'll give you this link though. And when you go there, you'll get a thank you for showing up there and showing interest in all this. And let me tell you about the thank you that you will be getting. That thank you, by the way, is 10 slides I put together for you to understand what this art of interpretation is about. What kinds of questions do we need to bear in mind when we interpret a text so that we make sure we actually read it well and faithfully. So that's what you're getting if you go there and fill it out. And filling it out takes about 5 seconds. Maybe 6. By the way, in the next video, I'll give you another link and I'll give you the resolution to the question of this parable of Mark 4. After all, parables are riddles and we want to know what's going on. I'll help you with that in the next video. See you there.